to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Hannah Tyler. In this week's episode, we're focusing on DACA, as the program and its recipients wait for a decision on the program's legality from the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. We'll welcome Niña Ledonio, BPC's Corporate Relations Manager and a DACA recipient, to talk about the program's impact on her life. This Week in Immigration regular, Theresa Cardinal Brown, will then join us to talk through the policy side of DACA, walking us through the Biden administration's recent final rule and the maze of litigation that DACA faces. Finally, Krish O'Mara Vignarajah, the president of Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, will join us to discuss the Afghan Adjustment Act. Welcome back. We're focusing on DACA today and are excited to welcome BPC's own Niña Ledonio. She's a valued colleague and also a DACA recipient and is joining us to talk about the program. Welcome, Niña.
Thanks.
So to start out, can you talk a little bit about the program's impact on your life?
To start, I've been on the program since it started in 2012, so that's 10 years on the dot. I renewed last year. And so it's just been a part of my life for 10 years, the routine of having to make sure the application goes in, making sure that you're up to date. But overall, it's had some of those, having to stay on top of that whole thing. You have to prove all these things. You have to show proof that you've arrived in the U.S. before the age of 16 as a kid. And there's all these requirements. I think there's 7 of them listed on the USCIS website. So that on top of being in the program for 10 years is already a lot of boxes to check as you pull your first or your fifth or your sixth, seventh, eighth application together, if those of us on the fifth get a sixth and seventh.
So can you talk a little bit about what it's like to renew every 2 years? What are the costs and sort of the administrative burdens associated with that 2-year renewal?
Logistically, there's the mental gymnastics having to go through, right? This will hopefully and obviously go away with and save a lot of trees with the new online filing. But I typically compile and mail anywhere from 80 to 100 pages of proof that I've continuously lived here since 2007. So that takes the form of anything and everything, such as a report card that I've received since I was in the 7th grade, to my high school diploma and my transcripts, my university degree, my tax returns, proof of employment. And if you're renewing, I tend to include every piece of paper USCIS and DHS has sent me to say my application was received and approved, which is 2 separate pieces of paper. And then on top of all that, you have to make sure you're on top of your personal DACA timeline when renewing. So you're allowed to renew your status within 6 months before it expires to account for, the bureaucratic process of it all. And, in the 4 applications I've submitted, 5 of them, the turnaround time I've seen for USCIS to receive, process, approve it has taken as fast as a couple of weeks and as long as 4 months. So that sort of waiting time is such a big question mark for people wondering, if my employment authorization is going to renew on time, what's my plan, what happens then? And then you have to go through the checklist of letting your employer know. On the financial side, it costs, and I believe with the new rule, it will still cost around $500 in administrative costs. That might have gone down just a little bit, to file renewal of your status every 2 years. So just for a little context, in order, and Theresa can fact check me later on this, but to apply for a green card or permanent resident status, it costs just around $5,000. So if you do the math, once a DACA recipient renews their status about 10 times, they will have spent the money it costs to apply for permanent resident status here. For those of us that have been in the program for 10 years, we're halfway there. So that's, annually, if you really boil it down, it costs about $250 a year to live in the United States, safe from deportation, but without any permanent status. You just get a card that lets you work.
Yeah, and backtracking a little bit, can you also talk a little bit about sort of the positive impact that the program has had on your life?
Yeah, for sure. So it's not all doom and gloom, right? I'm very fortunate to be able to be a working immigrant, right? Successful in the working world. I was able to go to college, to an undergrad university right after I graduated from high school. So those are all things that I would probably not have been able to do had I not been on the DACA program. And so a lot of those things have shaped a lot of who I am today. For context, and I'm I have no shame aging myself, but I'm 29 years old, and of the 29 years I've spent on this earth, 26 of them have been in the United States. So it really just is a part of my life, and is just, being able to really solidify that sort of presence here was positive, and it is thanks to Obama and the DACA program.
Let's talk a little bit about sort of the court cases and lawsuits and litigation that DACA has been through sort of since its inception. Can you talk a little bit about how these practically affect your life and how you feel about the continued litigation and Congress's continued inaction on the issue?
Yeah, so the lawsuits and the inaction from Congress puts you through this roller coaster of emotions, right? The inaction from the Senate specifically, again, fact check me later, but because the House has passed pro-DACA legislation before, is enraging to say the least. Overall, I'd say it gives me just a general lowered hope in our elected leaders when it comes to helping and supporting the undocumented immigrant communities that live in the states they represent. And the lawsuits are just really strong reminders, at least for me personally, that the program can end at any point. It's very much in this limbo status. So having that in the back of my mind, I'm always thinking of at least two contingency plans, if the program were to end today, tomorrow, next week, in 2 years. So it makes it hard for me to continue to sort of plan any real future life in the United States. You can sort of prophesize of, if this stays together, then this is what I would like to do. But that's really as far as you can go, which is ironic because we're called dreamers, right? And so that really puts a stop to that if you're having to constantly think of this limbo status.
What would you say, in an ideal world, your hopes for the future of the program would look like?
In an ideal world, maybe some point in the future, I would hope the program is somehow codified in law, which sounds so simple. So cough, cough, Senate, cough, cough, Congress. That includes hopefully a pathway to citizenship. It's not just, you guys can stay, you guys can work, and that's it. I hope there's some sort of expansion to the program. That's the pie in the sky goal. Obviously, I don't even want to put an amount of years that would take. In the interim, there are smaller improvements to the program that could be made. I don't actually know if the final rule that Biden issued allowed for new applications to the program. And I think just opening that gate could be a great start.
Can you talk a little bit about what it's like to have to be a policy expert on DACA as a recipient of the program, sort of an unwilling policy expert on something that has so much impact on your life?
Yeah, an accidental policy expert too, if you were to put that in my tagline somewhere. But, it's not one of those things that you asked for, right? It's just one of those things that you were dealt. But I think just having to weave through all of the jargon on government websites, even though English is my first language, it's still a lot of things to make sure you get right. So that's, on top of wanting to do other things with my career, you have to always continue to think of, is this still a rule? Can I still do this? And I have, then you'll have friends or people that know of your status that will just say like, hey, this is in the news. What does this say? And so in not wanting to misinform anyone, you want to be up on the rules if in case someone decides to come at you and say, this is what I heard about you on X channel, being also able to fact check them and just help them understand that that's not necessarily the case. So it's not something I asked for. It is something I became. And if it is helping educate people in what the program is like, what it's like to be a recipient of the program, I'm happy to do that.
So picking up on sort of the fact-checking thread, there are a lot of sort of myths associated with the program, that DACA recipients are children, that there's a permanent pathway to a green card for participants in the program, that recipients don't pay taxes, or that everyone in the program arrived here illegally. Can you talk a little bit about those myths, sort of what effects they have on you and how you do talk to others about the program and like associated myths and untruths that they may have heard.
Yeah, so just to debunk all of those that you listed, right? So DACA recipients are children. I believe I already said I'm 29 years old, so I'm definitely not a child. The program is called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival, so meaning we were children when we got here, however we got here. But many of us are working adults, successful business owners, doing our own thing, and living the American dream, quote unquote. So the next one, I guess, is there's a permanent pathway to green cards. While there have, like I mentioned, some bills that were passed in the House that would provide such a pathway to permanent residency or citizenship for us, the Senate has yet to take those up and make them into law. So there remains no clear permanent pathway for DACA recipients to a green card, to permanent resident status, to citizenship. Don't pay my taxes. This is one of my favorite ones. I have filed and paid taxes every year I have worked, which was the age of 17, or I have filled out something for someone to claim me as a dependent on their taxes when I could work. And that is part of what I send to DHS when I apply to renew. You can't say the same for a lot of people in this country about when it comes to their tax returns and what they're willing to surrender. And, I send that to DHS every 2 years. Arrived illegally is probably a big one, and a big one to assume just because of our undocumented status and nature. But not all DACA recipients arrived here illegally or crossed the border illegally or crossed a border physically. While there are those that have done that, there are those like myself that arrived on a plane with legal status. When my feet touched the ground in Reagan National, I had lawful status to be in this country. And so a lot of us have just lost that lawful status or overstayed some sort of visa. So when it comes to talking about the myths or, what's assumed of DACA recipients among other DACA recipients, I think it's a mixed bag, right? Some people are very affected about how that changes political rhetoric, how it changes how people view them. And then there are those that have also been in the program since 2012 that are like, let them think what they're going to think. I think I've sometimes fallen in that bucket. I waver back and forth. But when I talk to others that are just generally misinformed, it's mostly coming from a place of wanting to educate someone and say, does it look like I want to take your job at X company? Or, do I look like a 12-year-old that isn't contributing to society? Like, do I look like a criminal to you? So there's a lot of, trying to humanize the aspect of it. But I would say those sorts of questions to me personally have become less and less, but not to say that I don't get it, because I've definitely come a long way from offering up to people as something as I identify as.
Okay, well, those are all the questions that I have. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story, and we will continue to try to get something passed.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was great.
Okay, we'll now welcome back BPC regular Theresa Cardinal Brown to talk about the policy side of DACA and recent changes to the program, as well as the Fifth Circuit litigation on the program. She tweets at BPC_T Brown. Welcome, Theresa.
Hey, Hannah.
So let's pick up where Niña left off. Can you talk a little bit about the policy fallacies surrounding the program and how that affects both legislative action and public opinion?
I think, you and Niña addressed a lot of them. We first heard of the term dreamers in 2001, right? So it's been like more than 20 years that we first started hearing in immigration spaces on Capitol Hill about this issue of people who are brought to the United States as children but are undocumented. And because of that, do not have a way to get legal status in the United States absent congressional action. And these are people who grew up in the United States, as we talk about a lot. They really don't know another country other than the United States. They are American in every way but paperwork. And that sounds simple, but the paperwork is really hard to get. I mean, we just renewing the DACA status, you heard Niña talk about, hundreds of pages that she has to maintain and keep and copy. every single time she applies every 2 years. That's just like the tedious paperwork part of it. But the avenues by which someone who has undocumented status and has had undocumented status for a long time, like since they were children, it is very, very difficult. Our law not only doesn't, I won't say it doesn't make it easy, the law actually has impediments to anybody who has been in the United States for a long time in undocumented status from getting a green card, even if they had somebody that could sponsor them. So Niña works here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. She's able to do that because the DACA program gives her a work authorization document that allows her to work. Even if the BPC wanted to sponsor her for permanent residence, the fact that she has been undocumented would not allow her to get that green card. So it's not enough to have a sponsor. You have to also meet all these other requirements. And that's unfortunate because there are lots of, right now, 600,000 plus people like Niña in this country who are working, as she mentioned, business owners. They're valued employees. They are husbands and wives and parents and mortgage holders. So the fact that we haven't been able to find a permanent solution for them is tragic on a personal level for them. And I think tragic for our country that we can't figure out a way to do this. In terms of how those myths affect the politics of getting it done, I do think there's a certain amount of, now that they're adults, maybe they have responsibility for their own actions where they didn't when they came in and they could choose to leave. Well, we've already explained that going back to a country you've never known is not the same as being deported back to someplace you've just been, right? Like there's a very big difference there. I think some of the other myths that they're, somehow working and not paying taxes, once they receive that official employment authorization document from USCIS, they then are allowed to work legally and are on the books of any employer who employs them. That means that all of the appropriate taxes are taken out of their paycheck. They're required to file a federal income tax return every year. They can get a Social Security number, although it says very clearly it's not valid unless you also have this USCIS employment authorization document. So I think that some of these are, ways that people prejudge this group of people. I think the bigger issues about why we're having a hard time getting legislation is not, frankly, the worthiness, and I'm saying that in air quotes, of the DACA recipients themselves. There is widespread support for providing them permanency in the United States, even a path to citizenship, which would go through permanent residence. It is the overall politics of immigration. And there is a certain amount of people in the United States who believe no matter the circumstance, if they were here in an undocumented status, we should not ever give them any legal status because that would encourage more people to come. And I think that is maybe an understandable position that some people might take. We don't have a lot of evidence that's necessarily the case when we look at previous quote unquote amnesties, but I think it's also vastly unfair to the people like Niña who are holding, that we're laying that future possibility on their current situation and affecting them. So I think that's one of the things that we need to find a way to work our way through. I think the other aspect of it is just sort of, there's a lot of different issues in immigration right now. There's a real situation at the US-Mexico border, and the legislative reality is nothing's for free, right? There's always a trade-off. So, to the extent that people might want to help the DACA recipients, there's going to be a negotiated cost to pay to get that. And when I say cost, I just mean someone else wants something also that legislators have to be willing to give. And right now that conversation is around the border. So, it is certainly possible that, if the Fifth Circuit comes up with a decision that says, yes, we agree with District Judge Hainan that the program is illegal and that DACA will end, even though it might go to Supreme Court, you could hope that Congress would recognize that, okay, this program is now definitively on its last legs and we should try to do something. And maybe that will push some urgency to those conversations of, okay, if we're going to give permanent status to these folks, what is the trade-off? Can we agree to it? Can we get this done in a short period of time?
So speaking of the Fifth Circuit, they are poised to issue a ruling on the legality of the program any day now. We don't know when. After hearing arguments in early July, as you said, the issue went to the Fifth Circuit after federal district judge Andrew Hanen of Texas ruled that the policy is illegal, but he issued a temporary stay on the portion of his decision that would terminate DACA protections for current recipients. So can you tell us how we maybe expect the Fifth Circuit to rule on this case and how recipients and direct services organizations are preparing for the Fifth Circuit's possible ruling?
So I think most court washers and even the lawyers who are representing the government and other amicus brief filers in the case supporting the DACA program admit that this group of judges in the Fifth Circuit are highly conservative. They have previously upheld a decision that Judge Hanen issued declaring what Obama tried to do to expand DACA and create a program for the parents of these people. The DAPA program ruled that illegal. So I think most of them believe that this panel of Fifth Circuit judges will uphold Judge Hanen's ruling. We could be surprised. Courts have surprised us in the past, but the predominant prevailing wisdom, if you will, is that it's likely to rule in against the program. What that would mean depends really on the details of that ruling. So as you mentioned, Judge Hanen said the program itself was created illegally, that the Obama administration did not have the authority under law to create this program when they did so in 2012. If the Fifth Circuit upholds that, a couple of things can happen. They could say, look, the program was illegal ab initio, which means from the beginning, and so the status that anybody has is also null and void, and immediately everybody who currently has DACA falls out of status. I think that's maybe the least likely because there is an understanding pretty much noticed by all of the judicial entities that have looked at this that we have an awful lot of people who are currently relying on this status. Even Judge Hanen, as you mentioned, stayed his own order for those people already in the program, knowing that it was going to be appealed. So I think that's the least likely outcome if they rule against the program. What might be more likely is they would agree with Judge Hanen. They would maybe keep the underlying stay because they expect it to be appealed to the Supreme Court. And so it wouldn't change where we stand right now. Existing applicants can renew, but no new applicants can come in. I think the third option is that they say the program is illegal, but we will allow current applicants to keep their status until it expires naturally. And that would be anytime over the next 2 years. So the last person to apply and get approved before that decision comes down, they would have a full 2 years. But somebody whose status is pending, a renewal is pending at the time that order comes down, may not be able to extend and may fall out of status immediately. And then everybody else in between, depending on when their dates are up. So, by some estimates, it could be 1,000 people a day that might lose their status over the following 2 years. So those are the potential outcomes. And I think in light of those options, most service providers and people are encouraging anybody who has the ability to file for renewal to do so as soon as possible. Now, Niña talked about you can file up to 6 months before your current expiration date. What she didn't tell you is that if that's approved, it doesn't add 2 years to your previous expiration date. It starts 2 years from the date they approve it. So you file 6 months in advance, they approve it 6 weeks later, you've lost essentially 4 years of eligibility. You've lost 4 months of eligibility. Even though people are encouraging people to file renewals as soon as they can, no one knows how long USCIS will take to adjudicate them. They are backlogged in many of these cases. But if you can get your renewal done before this court order comes down, there's a better chance that you'll be able to at least keep your status for up to 2 years. So I think that's where people are encouraging DACA recipients to go.
And as you mentioned, if the Fifth Circuit rules that the program is illegal, which seems likely, the case will probably go to the Supreme Court. So what is the timeline for the case and a decision in the case, and how will it affect current recipients of the program?
So timelines for any federal judiciary are kind of reading tea leaves, right? They operate in their own time frame. So as you mentioned, the Fifth Circuit heard all the oral arguments in this case in July. And since then, we've been expecting a decision any day, right? So the longer it goes on, the more likely it is to come very soon. Then it really depends, how long it takes to appeal depends, right? So if the judge rules against the DACA program, it would be up to the Department of Justice on behalf of the Biden administration to appeal that decision to the Supreme Court. A couple of things can happen. They could seek an emergency stay from the Supreme Court if the Fifth Circuit withdraws the stay that Judge Hainan had and terminates the program immediately. That might be cause for them to go to the Supreme Court very, very quickly and say, hey, please, we intend to appeal. We think there are grounds to appeal. We think you're going to take this up. Will you please hold that decision? And then the Supreme Court can decide whether or not to grant that emergency stay of that district court or that circuit court decision. If that's not the case, if the program is allowed to continue, or at least existing DACA holders are allowed to keep their status for a while, DOJ may take a little bit longer to put together a full, what they call petition for certiorari, which is the formal request to the Supreme Court to take up this case on appeal. Now, unlike the federal circuit courts of appeals, the Supreme Court gets to pick which cases it wants to take up. So enough justices have to agree to take the petition, and then they schedule it for a hearing sometime during their term. How long that takes depends on when the first petition goes up, how long it takes the justices to make a decision on that petition, and then when they schedule it on their docket, which begins in October every year and ends around June. So the Supreme Court, if they decide, say this all happens this month and, the petition for cert goes up next month in October, it could be 2 or 3 months before the court decides whether or not to take up. If they wait until early next year to agree, or late this year, it may not get calendared to be heard until the springtime sometime, and then you'd expect sort of it to be one of the final decisions issued before the end of the term in June. If the timeline moves much later than that, it's quite possible the case wouldn't be heard until the next term, next fall. There's a lot of uncertainty that honestly makes it more imperative that Congress take this up, right? At the end of the day, the lifelines that this program has been given, frankly, since 2017, when Trump tried to end it, by the courts, those lifelines are running out. They're running out very, very quickly. And everyone agrees and everyone knows that Congress can act and either legislate the program to continue or give a pathway to citizenship for these individuals. And once they do it, all of the court cases become moot. They're gone. There's no need for them anymore because Congress has spoken. And so that's, I think, where everybody is looking, is saying, hey, Congress, stop kicking the can down the road. Stop waiting on the courts to sort of rescue you from having to do this. Just do what we elected you to do, which is legislate.
So on the topic of quickly running out lifelines, DHS issued a final rule at the end of August that aims to preserve and fortify the DACA program and would take effect on October 31st, 2022. Can you talk a little bit about that final rule, why the Biden administration issued it, what practical effect it has, and how it's different from previous iterations of the program, if at all?
So oftentimes, particularly in the press, you will hear that DACA was created by executive order. That's not precisely accurate. It was not created by a formal executive order signed by President Obama. It was created by the Obama administration under the auspices of a memorandum by then Secretary of Homeland Security Janet Napolitano to DHS, her own department, saying, this is what we're going to do. That memorandum did include some background and justification under statutes. It argued that under the Secretary's prosecutorial discretion, The secretary could choose whom to prioritize or deprioritize for enforcement actions, and under separate provisions of law had the ability to decide whether or not somebody who had been granted such a deferral could also get employment authorization. The fact that the program was created by this memorandum without a long justification or even notice and comment in the Federal Register was cited by the opponents of the program in these court cases as saying, even if it were legal, they didn't follow the proper procedure. So President Biden, under an executive order, yes, he signed an executive order early in his presidency, ordering the department to issue regulations and do everything it could to, quote unquote, preserve and fortify DACA. By promulgating a regulation, regulations have stronger legal footing than an executive memorandum from a secretary. Regulation cannot be changed by a subsequent administration without going through the whole formal process of rulemaking again. They went through the full notice and comment process, so the public had a chance to comment on it. They reviewed those comments, they responded to them, and publishing the final rule. As you mentioned, it is supposed to go into effect as of October 31st. However, the stay from Judge Hainan would pretty much obviate this rule, and certainly if the Fifth Circuit ruled that that DACA was illegal, then the regulation wouldn't have any legal foundation. So this is kind of one of the quirks. One of the questions is whether or not this regulation is now new and should be considered by the Fifth Circuit rather than just the original memorandum in determining whether the program is legal. I think it's going to have little effect on that because they're really looking at statutory authority, not whatever justifications were in the rulemaking. So it's kind of on hold, especially if the Fifth Circuit issues its ruling before the effective date of the regulation. But more importantly, the regulation does not reopen new applications. It can't reopen new applications as long as Judge Hainan's order is there. It also didn't change any of the original criteria. So when DACA was created in 2012, it said you had to have arrived in the country before the age of 16 and before 2007. And you had to show continuous presence in the United States since then, thus the volumes of documents that Niña talks about having to submit. But the farther away we get from 2007, the fewer and fewer people could still qualify to get into the program. So it was a bit of a disappointment to many immigration advocates that the Biden administration didn't move that date forward so that if the rule went in place, the program could accommodate more recent arrivals. So I think that's one of the disappointments. It kept all of those things in. So, I think the rule does what President Biden said in the executive order. It preserves and fortifies the existing DACA program. It doesn't change it. And that may have been on purpose to not affect the litigation going forward. If they had tried to expand it, such as Obama tried to do with the work he did in 2014, the courts overruled that. So that may be why they decided they couldn't expand it in this. So I think, the rulemaking kind of has to wait until we see what happens after the Fifth Circuit. But again, I just go back. Ultimately, it's Congress, right? Law supersedes regulation, even if regulation supersedes a memorandum in terms of, fortifying the program. It's really up to Congress to pass a statute then.
And since we're on the topic of Congress, is there any legislative path forward for the program? And what do you think it will take for Congress to take action and preserve the program?
As Niña mentioned, the House of Representatives has, in the last two Congresses, passed legislation that would have fortified and extended and created a pathway to citizenship for dreamers, not just DACA recipients. Those were passed primarily on partisan votes, mostly Democratic votes. A few Republicans did support the bill in the House, but it was not a majority of the Republican Party. But, the Senate requires 60 votes, which means at least 10 Republicans would have to get on board, and that hasn't happened yet. Democrats did try to get broad legalization provisions through a mechanism that would have only required 50 votes, reconciliation, and we have talked about that extensively on this podcast throughout 2021 and the early part of 2022 as that was being tried, and they were unsuccessful. So at this point, at least for the remainder of this Congress, which lasts until the end of 2022, there are a few options. The Senate could put together its own negotiated bill, a package. I think it's unlikely they'll take up the House bill just because there's definitely not 60 votes for the House bill in the Senate right now. We understand that various members of Congress from both parties have been in discussions for months and months and months. We haven't seen any legislative text produced by this group. We don't even know what the parameters of a deal that they might agree to would look like. But time is running out, right? Congress has a bunch of things it has to get done before it leaves in December. Oh, and there's an election in November, and which means they want to spend as much time outside of DC campaigning as they possibly can, which shortens even the amount of time the remainder this year they have to get legislation done. And frankly, depending on the outcome of the elections in November, the appetite for Republicans to do this kind of legislation might change. Now, I can't say either way, right? A lot will depend on whether the Senate flips as well as the House, which many are predicting, and by how many votes. It might be advantageous to Republicans if they take back the House but not the Senate to try to do something at the end of this year and kind of take this issue off the table so they don't have to worry about it next year, if their membership will support it. I think there will be a group of people who say, no, we have more leverage next year, hold out, we won't be able to do it. And frankly, that's true not just on this issue, but on any number of issues outside of immigration. That calculus remains to be seen. So I think it's suffice it to say, there's a very narrow pathway that DACA legislation or DREAM legislation can pass, or any immigration legislation can pass this year. It's not impossible. And at the end of the day, if members feel like it has to be done now, if the court rules that the program goes away, and they hear loud and clear from across their constituencies that it is imperative that they get something done, then maybe that'll light some fire under their feet and put some energy in these talks to get something across the finish line. But we just have to wait and see.
Okay, well, thank you for the policy nuts and bolts as always and the update. And we will go into our next segment.
Now we're going to switch gears. It has been just over a year since the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan and the chaotic evacuation of tens of thousands of people, including Afghans who supported the United States government in the country, many of whom were brought to the United States and provided temporary parole. We are now joined by Krish O'Mara Vignarajah, the president of Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, whose organization was very much in the middle of those chaotic days of working to evacuate and welcome those Afghans, to talk about the Afghan Adjustment Act, its importance, its legislative path, and the hurdles it has faced. And by the way, she tweets at Krish Vignarajah. Welcome, Krish.
Thank you so much for having me.
So talk a little bit about the Afghan Adjustment Act. Why is it necessary? What's in the bill? And why do you think that it's important to get it passed?
Sure. So the Afghan Adjustment Act is how we keep our nation's promise to the allies of America's longest war. It's an unfortunate necessity because the vast majority of the approximately 76,000 Afghans who were evacuated from Kabul last summer were admitted to the U.S. on a tenuous status, something called humanitarian parole. So the administration turned to parole as a solution because it inherited a decimated refugee resettlement system when it came into power and a severely backlogged special immigrant visa program. So under normal circumstances, those are mechanisms we would have used to move these allies to safety. And had they arrived as refugees or SIV holders, they would already be on a pathway to permanent legal residence. But humanitarian parole offers no such pathway to long-term protection. It essentially allows Afghans to live and work here for 2 years, but their only viable option to remain is applying for asylum. And there are a number of problems with this, of course. For one, the asylum system is severely backlogged, as well as, with over 600,000 cases in the queue. It's also a highly complex process to navigate, so it requires documentation that many of these individuals don't have access to because they were forced to flee with just the clothes on their backs. A lawyer could be helpful, but there simply aren't enough to handle 70,000 clients at once. And Afghan evacuees don't have the financial resources to afford one in most cases. So that's where we need a legislative fix through the Afghan Adjustment Act. It would allow these 70,000 Afghans to adjust their status and become legal permanent residents. So that's why we've been urging Congress to pass the adjustment legislation, because the clock is counting down on their parole status. It's passed identical legislation previously for Vietnamese allies, for Cubans fleeing communism, and more recently for Iraqi Kurdish allies. So it's not just well-rooted in a historical precedent. It would be unprecedented if Congress didn't do this for this wartime evacuee population. And let me just end by saying, let's not forget the moral imperative here. These are people who worked alongside us in combat and diplomacy. They championed our values as NGO workers, journalists, women's rights activists. They have more than earned the right to be safe and to call America their home. And so we're hopeful that Congress will recognize the moral imperative to let them stay permanently.
So you mentioned it would help those who are settled in the United States. Would it have any impact on the Afghans who are still outside the United States and seeking to come to the country? What's available for them?
Yeah, great question. Because it would have a huge impact on them as well. At LRS, we've seen firsthand this kind of legal purgatory and how it has been a major source of anxiety for so many of our clients. Our case managers regularly call clients who are worried sick about their prospect for remaining on the safety of American soil. So getting this bill would represent a degree of certainty for a population that desperately needs this kind of stability. It would also save time and money because they aren't in the position of having to, navigate the complex asylum process. And in terms of Afghans outside of the U.S., the bill could directly and indirectly benefit them as well. So as parolees adjust to green card holders and U.S. citizens, they can then petition USCIS to bring over family members. But I think it's worth noting a few other provisions in the bill that are relevant to those left behind in Afghanistan. It would actually require the U.S. Department of State to implement an office capable of reviewing visa applications and providing other consular services for Afghans as long as there is no operational embassy in Afghanistan. The bill would also establish an interagency task force led by the State Department, which would be responsible for creating and implementing a strategy to continue relocation and resettlement over the next 10 years. And finally, it would require the State Department to respond to congressional inquiries related to SIV applications or U.S. refugee admissions referrals. So beyond the adjustment status, there is definitely some focus on the allies who remain in Afghanistan.
So where do we stand in terms of the resettlement of Afghans? Obviously we had that big surge of resettlements right as we were evacuating Afghanistan. I assume there's been some additional resettlements, maybe from the so-called lily pad places that were overseas. Where do we stand on that original cadre of folks who were evacuated, and how are they doing in the U.S.?
Yeah, so we at LRS have resettled almost 14,000 Afghans, and after a year, we've seen so many families find hope and safety in their new communities. They're thankfully in safe, stable, long-term accommodations. Children are enrolled in school where they're learning, they're making friends, they can be kids again. Many have found their first job and have reached self-sufficiency. I certainly noticed when I started talking to clients, that was one of the most pressing questions they had. How could they start supporting their families? How could they start contributing as Americans to their local communities? Of course, that's not to say there aren't challenges, even beyond their uncertain legal status. A major challenge they're still facing is meaningful employment. Some are facing significant language barriers. Others face challenges in terms of transportation, just getting to job interviews or medical appointments, especially if they're not housed near public transportation. Many high-skilled Afghans, people who were doctors, lawyers, engineers back home, find themselves unable to work in their field of expertise. And obviously, that's frustrating for them that's a real disadvantage for the local communities who now call them neighbors, because obviously, we are amidst a labor shortage and 11 million open jobs. What we see is that these newcomers, they're driven, enthusiastic, they want to work, they want to contribute to their new communities. So we're eager to match them with employers who are looking for reliable, skilled, and ambitious employees, because that's who our clients are. And then just, one final point on the mental health of these new arrivals. It's obviously a traumatic thing to lose your homeland, to have to navigate a brand new culture and to deal with that while your family's back in Afghanistan and you're worried sick about them. So it bears repeating that while resettlement is very much a sprint to self-sufficiency, it's also a marathon, and that can take years in terms of feeling that stability and integrating into a new country.
Yeah. So we know that the bill has been introduced in both the House and the Senate by both Republicans and Democrats. It's a bipartisan bill in both houses. What do you see as a possible legislative pathway to enactment here? What are some of the hurdles the bill is facing when it comes to passage?
Thankfully, the legislation has had clear, broad support based on its, bipartisan, bicameral introduction last month. I think that's a reflection of the big tent of veterans, refugee advocates, faith communities, civil society groups, Afghans themselves, who have zealously fought for congressional action for more than a year. In terms of passage, we have been pushing for the Adjustment Act to be included in the upcoming budget bill that Congress just released the draft text of this morning. Unfortunately, legislators have really missed an opportunity to keep our nation's promise because it wasn't included. We're obviously disappointed, but we're not going to back down. There is a ticking clock on these Afghans' parole status, so it is incumbent upon congressional leadership to make sure this bill moves in the nearest possible legislative vehicle. It's also worth noting that this is a request that the White House has made not once, not twice, but now 3 times. This isn't just the right thing to do. It is widely popular across the electorate. The fall of Kabul and Operation Allies Welcome brought Americans of all backgrounds together, and it really bridged a political divide. We have polling data that shows that more than 75% of Americans support this bill, and that's largely on a bipartisan basis as well. And so that's why we continue to urge legislators to enshrine in law that this country isn't just our Afghan allies' safe harbor, it's their home.
So I know that I've been reading that some Republicans have raised some security concerns. There was a recent report by the Department of Homeland Security's Inspector General that found that there were some evacuees who were maybe not fully vetted before they came to the United States. What do you say to those concerns, and does this bill address those concerns?
I think the bill does. The Afghan Adjustment Act is exactly the mechanism by which we can address any of these lingering concerns. When these Afghan parolees request an adjustment of status, DHS would run additional background checks. They'd complete a comprehensive biometrics analysis again, and they would conduct an additional in-person screening interview for each applicant before approval, precisely to make sure they are not a national security or public safety threat to the U.S. This is an additional layer of screenings equivalent to what refugees are subject to, which is to say it is part of the most stringent vetting process of any immigrant admitted to the U.S. So we are actively working on the Hill to educate elected officials who may be on the fence, because we really do not think that these security concerns are a reason to not move forward. And we're confident that Republican legislators will recognize the imperative to swiftly pass the bill.
Well, Krish, thank you so much for walking us through that. I know you and your organization have been very busy, not only with the Afghans, but with the Ukrainians and the other refugees that the United States is trying to resettle this year. So thank you so much for joining us on the podcast this week.
Always nice chatting, Theresa. Thanks again.
And that's it for our show this week. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Brown at BPC_T Brown, and I'm on Twitter at Hannah E. Tai. I'm Hannah Tyler. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Hannah Tyler and Theresa Cardinal Brown. For the last time, Ethan Plotkin produces and edits our show, and we want to thank him for everything that he's done for us and wish him well. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.